Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Sci-Fi. The bad news is no Elliot today, but don't leave just yet, because the good news is I've been in London today with Jodi Dean, had a phenomenal conversation about Neo-Feudalism, what's happening in capitalism today, what kinds of shifts this digital capitalist era have brought in, and for psychoanalytic types, stay tuned, because we also talk about the question of psychosis and how to deal with the real and the imaginary in this particular digital environment. Today also Jodi has an article in Sublation Magazine, so where some of these ideas are explored in print, so please go to sublationmag.com, check out Jodi Dean's article and enjoy the show. Thanks for listening, guys. So let's start with talking about, so in your recent articles have been dealing with, I guess, this question of over the last sort of 10 years or so, we've heard a lot of kind of discussions of a new phase of capitalism, Mackenzie Walt's kind of statement about the sort of end of capitalism, terms like platform capitalism, and ideas that we're in a new phase or something. And one of the things that's come out of this is this concept of Neo-Feudalism, which is something you've been working on and writing about. And it's the idea that basically we've entered a post-capitalist phase or a neo-feudalist phase of capitalism, right? Would that be right? Or it's out of capitalism into neo-feudalism? So perhaps we could sort of talk about what neo-feudalism is first and how you see that sort of shift happening.
Okay, so the way I want to think about this is that capitalism is turning itself into something else. And so the idea is to understand capitalism's own processes and how they can actually create something that's not capitalist. So the argument is that neo-feudalism is a set of tendencies within capitalism's own self-undermining. So how do we understand that? We can do that in different ways. So we recognized as Marxists that of course capitalism brings about its own demise, creates its own grave diggers and all that. So that's something we're used to thinking about. So we're used to thinking about capitalism able to do something that destroys itself. But typically, in a Marxist way, we think about this as leading to something better, as creating the conditions for socialism. But what if it's something else? Right? What if capitalism can change itself in ways that are worse rather than better for the majority? And that's the kind of neo-feudal thesis.
Okay, so it's also a question of as leftists, communists, whatever we see ourselves as, how do we deal with this kind of problem that if we've been waiting for the end of capitalism for X period of time, but what if it happens or has happened and it's been replaced by something worse rather than the sort of dream of communism to come?
Exactly, when I've had different friends read parts of this, and one of my friends named Jacob is always just gets really upset about periodization. He's you can't say we're in a totally different period. He's right. That's right, and that's not my claim. My claim that we're in a transition period. I mean, and we should be able to think that as leftists, given that Marx's own account of the rise of capitalism takes place over hundreds and hundreds of years, right? He recognizes the mercantilism and the commercialization that was prominent in the Mediterranean that didn't lead to capitalism proper. So we need to be able to recognize that it's not going to be, here we've got this clear period and that clear period and this clear period, but that we can be in a transitional time where things have a lot of different tendencies intertwined with one another.
Right. But there's still a sort of reason to historicize it in this way. Right?
Yeah, and the reason to historicize it in terms of neo-feudalism is that makes us pinpoint a set of specific attributes. So the ones that I emphasize are parcelization of sovereignty, a kind of rise of new lords and serfs, hinterlandization, and a kind of atmospheric or vibe of catastrophe, anxiety, apocalypticism. So I think of those four attributes of the present let us see the present as, oh God, this doesn't look like doesn't look like bourgeois democracy, it doesn't look like social democracy, it looks a lot more like feudalism.
Right. So maybe we should talk about those four things if that's the way to approach it. But because I was next going to ask, so what are the characteristics of like feudalism, should we say, that we can perceive now. So I don't know if you want to like take one of those or those
Sure.
four kind of ideas, and you know, so like, because what does it precisely mean to say that if you look at our structure today and the way our society is functioning, we can see feudalist characteristics?
So parcelization of sovereignty, I love that term. It's on the one hand, it's a kind of classic term to use to talk about feudalism, but also Perry Anderson and Ellen Meikson's Wood really use that as a crucial aspect of European feudalism, and it thinks it's relevant for where we are now. What does it mean? It means that rather than sovereignty being consolidated in a nation state, where there's a clear line with clear version of law, whether or not it's understood constitutionally or is state-backed, but you have a clear locus of law and how it's exercised, instead there is a blurring of political economic processes and a blurring of forms of public and private law. Okay,
Right.
so for example, in the US, what you have is really cash-strapped municipalities using their police forces to shake down people to make money from tickets and court fees and that kind of thing. That,
Right.
yeah, and that usually hits black people and working class people the hardest, right? Because they're the ones who are less likely to get out of the ticket and most likely to attract the attention of the police. You see a similar process where political and economic forms are blurring together in ways that are kind of against what we think of as the rule of law and state sovereignty. You see this in the ways that Canadian fossil fuel companies sue Latin American countries after the Latin American countries pass laws regarding restricting minings and various environmental things, and the Canadians sue them and like, oh no, you violated our market privileges and blah blah blah, and then this goes what to international arbitration courts. And these arbitration courts are private actors as well. So again, there's not a kind of legal system that we think of as the marker of bourgeois modernity. Instead, you've got various kinds of private law. And legal theorists have been talking about this for about a decade as well. So it's not just the tech people who've been talking about these feudal tendencies of the digital economy. In law, you have people talking, like a guy named Alan Supiat has been talking about the shift from a rule of law to a rule of men, and government by contract to government by kinds of like deeds and pacts and things like networked privileges, rather than something like a rule of public law. A guy named Robert Kuttner and his co-author have been writing about the privatization of public law and the rise of a privatized jurisprudence. In the everyday ways we see this are things like people signing non-disclosure agreements, non-compete agreements. Everything goes to arbitration rather than the rule of law.
I mean, I thought in the articles, which I'm not sure if there are two. There's one in the LA Review of Books and one in New Left Review. We'll put the links just underneath this video. But one of the things that was really interesting to me was what you just mentioned in there, that this way that the police were actually told in this case to go out and charge people, fine people, not to like police, but precisely in order to raise revenue.
Oh yeah,
right,
it's not about safety or policing, it's about money.
Right, and then you also point out how this disproportionately affects people of colour, class inequality there as well. And you're saying that this pattern can also be seen in, say, the law courts, right, with arbitration and so on. Am I understanding this right?
That's exactly right.
So there's a reason why, and the NDA, this is a revenue generating feature of the legal system, right?
Yep.
So it becomes. Right, so this...
And it's a way, it's not just quite for NDAs, it's more like making people extract themselves from the provisions of law and agree to the private adjudication of grievances. So, I mean, what is that like? That's just like serfs having to go to the Lord, like the Lord makes the rules, the Lord enforces the rules, they get money from the Lord, I mean, they get not money from the Lord, but the Lord takes, like, his tithe or whatever, extracts the surplus and adjudicates. So their economic and their political, legal, juridical relations are all mediated through the Lord. That's the same thing that's happening now in more and more workplaces.
Yeah, no, it's actually amazing
It's
when
horrible.
you put it like that, and horrible. Yeah, and it does. It does sound like when you think of its structure, it does sound something completely archaic and out of date, but
it's completely weird.
But it's becoming. You think this process is increasing. I mean, I suppose it makes me also think of like this legal versus civil case situation, because we often see the rhetoric about, you know, the legal system did not prosecute something they should have done, so you have to then use the. Do you call it a civil suit when it's a private suit?
That's right.
So does that map onto this? Is this like the failure of public law that has allowed this?
Yeah, I think that's a really smart observation. So one of the things that we know is that public courts are really overburdened. Right, like they don't, like I don't know if that's the same in the UK, but in the US, public courts don't, you know, people can wait for months and months and even years for their case to be heard. When people are, particularly low-income people, when they get into the legal system and they're dependent on public attorneys, like they're really screwed to the wall. So there's not been sufficient support and funding for public courts. So who can afford to go to civil suits? Right, people with money, right? Not everyone can afford to pursue a civil remedy after the public remedy has been blocked for them. So again, that's a class-based approach to law. It's not public law anymore. It's separate law for rich and poor, right? Separate law for the lords and like basically bupkis for the serfs.
It is, isn't it? I mean, not only is there the fact of what you said, that if you can afford to, you can take yourself out of the justice system, but you've also got with the civil court, you've got, if you're wealthy enough, you can have a whole nother trial in a whole other court.
That's right. And you can forum hunt, and you can look for different places to adjudicate it. I mean, look at these. You know, I hate to mention this. Don't shoot me, but like the Johnny Depp Amber Heard case.
No, well, they formed.
Yeah, they Johnny Depp shopped for a place to find what court was going to be most likely to give him a good ruling.
Right.
So I mean, because they didn't do well. Like I guess his case didn't do well in London,
that's right,
in the UK, but go figure, it went better for him in Virginia.
Yeah,
so.
It's amazing. Okay, so let's so this is the example of private public law. Let's carry on saying why things are feudal, and then we'll talk about the other. So maybe what about this concept of hinterland? I also thought this was really interesting.
Yeah, this hinterlandization. So the general idea is to think about the neo-feudal landscape or the spatiality of neo-feudalism. And the first kind of cut is kind of wonderful, thriving, lively cities surrounded by kind of miserable wastelands. So, and this is pretty much a global phenomenon. Like you'll have really mega cities that attract investment, that attract large numbers of wealthy people, that have real estate booms, and then parts of countries and areas that are basically abandoned or abandoned by capital, left out. There's no jobs, there's no development, the infrastructures crumble. So people leave these hinterlands. So the hinterlands become, I don't know if it's the same here, but in the U.S. it looks like sort of strip malls, call centers, so big distribution centers.
Like suburbs, but also
worse, like abandoned suburbs.
Abandoned
suburbs, and places like where the giant warehouses are for warehouse distribution centers. Those kinds of places, call centers, server farms. So there's actually a fairly specific look that these areas start to have. Like a lot of the town part would usually be boarded up. I mean, most of those businesses would have already gone down, 10 or 20 years ago, and now they're attracting very specific kinds of I don't know, investment's not quite the right word, but they become opportunities for the people who need a giant warehouse, like Amazon or something like that. Yeah. So hinterlandization, and then again the general spatiality is lively centers surrounded by these kind of desperate areas. In the U.S., the desperate areas are also characterized by large scale opioid death, drug abuse. Really? In the U.S., the hinterlands are areas with really high rates of suicide, drug abuse, and diseases of despair has been the kind of media term that's caught on for this. And the thing is, this kind of landscape of despair also cuts into cities. So even in the thriving cities, you'll have divisions within. So some places are these like guarded mini fortresses
Yes.
of the very rich,
Yes.
while other ones are decayed. Again, infrastructural support and public support is pulled from them, and it's all about private money.
I mean, what you're describing there, I think it probably is a global thing because,
Yeah.
I mean, just before I came here, moved back home here to London, I was in Hong Kong and in East China as well, and you could really see this, you know, where Amazon or equivalents, you know, one of Alibaba or a company like that in Hangzhou will get a warehouse in a kind of hinterland area, and loads of people will live there just to work there, and it's an incredibly depressing life. But you also see in Hong Kong exactly what you're saying there, that there'll be almost gated communities of one thing, and then around it this kind of hinterland of.
Yeah, Phil Neal has a book called it's Hinterland or Hinterlands, and he describes this as a global phenomenon, drawing out exactly like you did the places in China where this is phenomenon, and comparing China to the U.S. I think he also mentions Ukraine as places where you can just really visibly see this phenomenon of hinterlandization.
No, it's extremely interesting. I mean, okay, and so again, this is something that one can see in a feudal.
Yeah, so I hate to use this expression because it's just so cheesy, but in some ways we can think of neo-feudalism almost as a lens. Like it's such an overused term, but as a critical lens for pulling the pieces together. I think it's more than a lens. I actually think that that it should be understood as a kind of as a category of political economy for the present. But for right now, we can just think of it as a lens that lets us kind of bring into alignment a set of things that we might keep separately. Oh, one last thing on hinterlands. There's we can also recognize lots of current politics in terms of the politics of hinterlands. For example, politics around social reproduction crises can be understood as hinterland politics. So whether or not you go this from like the Yellow Vest protest were about rising prices and gas prices, right? Whether or not, however, even though they had different valences, ultimately it was a protest of the hinterland saying to the elites, we're not going to pay for your policies, right? We can't afford to do this. And the generalized crises of care that people talk about in the U.S., strikes of teachers and nurses, all of these are forms of politics that target the production of these hinterlands, or the ways that privatization has produced a kind of landscape of despair in which people are trapped. So I think that one of the interesting things about hinterlandization is it lets us name a location for a set of political processes that are fairly dominant right now. Also, where I live, which is in rural New York, I mean, there's problems around hospital closures. Hospitals are either purchased by private companies, and lots of what they'd formerly provided are cut, or they're just closed down entirely. Mental health facilities closed down entirely. So all this should be understood as hinterlandization.
As part of that process. I mean, it makes totally does make sense. I mean, I want to. So we talked about the hinterlands. We talked about the question of private and public courts.
The new lords and serfs.
Yeah. So let's cover.
Okay. So the new lords and serfs. I mean, on the one hand, that part really is sort of more metaphorical.
Yeah.
But not completely, and particularly when we think about platforms. It's like Uber or Airbnb. What is so wild about these platforms is they change our relation to things that we ostensibly own, like our cars and our apartments or houses. So things that were ours, like bought by, either through our own personal debt that we will pay off because of our labor, or just basically through the proceeds of our labor, things that were ours now become vehicles for the capital accumulation of another. Our owning of these means of accumulation actually turns sort of like goes over into becoming means for our oppression. The way I like to think about it is the commodity changes form to become capital for another, namely the platform owners. So the platform owners, some people want to say, well, really, of course, everybody who works for Deliveroo or Lyft or Uber, these things that they're employees. I mean, there's legal cases all around this.
Yeah.
I think that we need to take seriously the fact they're not employees. They're independent contractors. How come? So the companies don't employ them. The companies provide them with an app and take a cut from the use of the app.
Yeah.
The companies aren't buying rides from drivers, right? The company, you say Uber, Uber connects, Uber makes a market, right? It comes in as an intermediary to create a market and bring together people in a market who before could not meet in a market, namely private drivers and ride seekers. And then they take a cut for that service. So they're not employers in any capitalist sense. They do not own the means of production, and they do not purchase labor power. So I don't think, so no Marxist can call them employees. Additionally, large percentages, I mean, and the division is a division among the drivers as well, right? But large percentages of drivers don't want to be employees. They're like, why in the world would we think being an employee is some sort of great thing to be? It sucks to be an employee, right? If you're an employee, somebody else is controlling your time. So in some ways, they like the idea that they're independent, though the reality sucks. And so what I think about this is that there's this continued process. It's like Marx describes in the Grundrisse, this process of separation. And now, instead of being simply separated from our means of subsistence, we're separated from the market. And the platform comes in to connect us. So we're doubly dependent. So we're dependent on earning, but we can't earn without this platform coming in and giving us access to the market.
Yes.
So I think that it makes sense. So in another way to put this is, Marx criticizes free labor, right, in Grundrisse and Capital, when he's talking about and now the workers, they're free workers, as in freed from their own means of subsistence. Right, so they're freed, as in, freedom on one side is dependent on another. And with these platforms, there's free now from being employees. I'm freed from the conditions that entrap me as an employee, but now I'm dependent at another level, dependent on the app for access to the market.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it makes sense, and it's not just Uber, it's a whole range of things. It's the same logic for Airbnb or whatever. It's definitely really important to think about this, because clearly these digital platforms are part of this shift. I think that's what's critical as well here, that this, and I also think of things that are less in the public eye with this kind of thing, things like Amazon Mechanical Turk, and Turking platforms, this kind of gig economy type job services, which actually aren't just the ones we see, is really characterising this exact thing that you described. I think that's exactly right. But I suppose my question is that, do we see this kind of what do you call this, middleman, mediator between the market and the worker in a feudal system?
This is a really good question. So the way I think about this is we've got personal chains that are coming into play. So the condition of labor for the driver is specific on whatever that driver is willing to do that day. So it's different from going into a factory where everybody has roughly the same conditions. The driver has to do things like, get up at a particular time to beat the other people, to to make sure that they're on a particular, in order to get access to the specific routes, it requires a set of specific steps that the driver does. I'm not explaining this very well, but the way to think the way to think about this is the personalization of everything. So let me try another way. It's a little bit easier to do it through the consumer way. If you buy a plane ticket these days, what happens? You get, if you start looking around, your browser will register that you've been looking for these tickets. And so the second or third time you search for the same ticket, the prices will change a little bit because it shows that you're interested. So then let's say you see the price of the ticket, you want that ticket. You say yes. The next thing that happens is you get 4 or 5 alternatives to change what you've just agreed to. Well, do you want this extra thing? Do you want to be strapped to the wing, or do you want to actually have a seat?
Yeah.
Do you want to be committed to have a seat? Do you want to do you want to take any luggage with you? Are you going to take something in the cabin, right? And then you do all of that, and then it's like, and would you like something better? Like, no. Do you want a sandwich? No. Then it's like, in case everything goes wrong, do you want to? Are you going to absorb the risk yourself, or what? So you've got a million personalized questions to go through with the purchase. And then at the end of that, it may not even be the case that you get that ticket, because the airline can cancel it at any moment. So what 40 years ago would have been a very basic transaction in a market, anybody who wants item X, which is trip from London to New York, gets that. And then the airline is obligated to provide that, and the time and blah, blah, blah. Now that has changed. And so the standardization associated with, let's just call it bourgeois modernity, goes away in favor of these very specific, small, I think that was small kinds of chains that are facilitated by the networks.
Which is similar to the way a delivery driver has to do step 1,
exactly
2, 3, 4,
right.
5.
Exactly
so it's
right.
part of... Yeah, okay, great. I mean, this is a bit of a digressive question, I suppose, but also, in a way, what I'm really interested in my own sort of research, I suppose. But how do you think these, and I suppose this is almost a psychoanalytic question, how do you think these... There are also presumably enormous psychological effects of this, or transformation of the worker and their affects. Like what... Because the worker who goes through this process, or the consumer that goes through this process, do you also think this is like a psychological question, like this new subject of worker or consumer is a different kind of psychological being, entity? Is it transforming what it means?
I think so. I think of I was asked last year when I did the Birkbeck Critical Theory Summer School, what did I think the subject... I was asked a question about the subject of neo-feudalism. And I actually think that there's not a neo-feudal subject, that we have the breakdown because of the parcelization of sovereignty and these sorts of fragmentations, and then personalized change and personalized networks of fealty and loyalty, and also kind of subservience, that instead of there being exactly a subject, we should think about it in terms more of like of affects, a vibe, an atmosphere, and that I would say, sort of on a kind of technical level, is a psychotic one. And that so why psychotic? In the kind of bumper sticker way is like, well, another way to think about the parcelization of sovereignty is the decline of symbolic efficiency, and the collapse of the symbolic involves in the merger of the imaginary and the real. And what is that? That's a psychotic element, a psychotic structure where we're dependent constantly on the imaginary, but we can't really tell, what's real, what's imaginary. Like COVID, right? COVID never had a clear symbolic registration, as in, here's the dominant order of COVID that everybody recognizes. Instead, it was like a crazy conspiracy that aggressive totalitarian states were installing to take our freedom. It was the way China was going to take over the world. It was always some kind of hoax. It was fraudulent, and then it was like COVID may be real, but it doesn't matter. And then the vaccines aren't real, masks aren't real. Everything was. There was not one, even with COVID, right? We didn't have one world or one symbolic understanding of this mass, of this pandemic. So I think we should think about then the kind of not quite the subjectivity, but the affective environment of neo-feudalism as one that's psychotic. And that helps us then understand and think about the catastrophism, the widespread anxiety that people encounter. There's no place to register this.
Yes, I think that's a great point. And it comes to what I was going to ask. The next question I want to get on to sort of talking about what the left maybe can do, and what you said about anti-communism as well against this system. But first of all, not everyone agrees with this feudalism claim, right?
Right.
You also wrote about Morozov's kind of critique, and so there is also a kind of kickback against this idea of saying that this is a kind of feudalism. And I guess that connects to what you were just mentioning with catastrophe and ideas of catastrophe. So kind of, I guess the question is, what's at stake in this debate between people who want to say that this is a moment of neo-feudalism and those who kind of reject that interpretation? What's at the stake in that kind of disagreement?
To my mind, the primary stake is, do we think that capitalism can always evolve and is some kind of eternal formation, or do we recognize it as a historical formation that has an origin and can end? And so I think the number one issue is it possible to think that, or to understand, to have an analysis that can recognize, like, the system isn't recognizably capitalist anymore? So what would that involve? It would mean that you have to separate what is capitalist from what is not capitalist. Typically, capitalism is understood in terms of having specific laws of motion, like investment of the proceeds. We always think, like, the capitalists make money to put it back into production. So there's investment and reinvestment. There is improvements, that's supposed to be part of capital, and there's competition. Like, those three things are basic laws of motion that are supposed to drive capitalism as a process. The neo-feudal thesis says, like, hey, wait a minute. The majority of large-scale companies are not putting money back in. They're eating their proceeds or hoarding, right? They hoard and they eat it. They give it to executives as stock buyback. They give it to executives in executive pay. They buy back stocks from their investors to feed this kind of, financial economy. They also, and we see this a lot in the platforms, particularly Uber, they also destroy markets. I mean, they made disruption and destruction into their game plan. I mean, the wild things, like, Uber never made a profit. I mean, things like WeWork, another similar thing, trying to destroy an entire real estate sector. They don't make a profit. They use the massive amounts of money generated by the neoliberal financialization. What are you going to do with that money? Nobody in the investor class thinks that they can make any money or make sufficient profit by investing in production. So they invest in these massive schemes to destroy markets and make quick billions.
Yeah. No, I mean, so in a weird way, and I kind of want to, I don't know if I'm getting this completely wrong, but it occurs to me to say that there's almost a kind of hope here. Because, and it connects to Mark Fisher's arguments and things, do we see capitalism, as you said, as this kind of all-encompassing thing that we can't escape from? Okay. Or, if there's something right in this argument about neo-feudalism, even if it's something worse, even if capitalism has turned into something worse, at least it stops capitalism being this infinite, all-encompassing thing that must necessarily remain, or we can't imagine alternatives to, for example. So, do you think there's almost a sort of a possibility of saying, from a, say, socialist perspective, maybe we could talk about communism in a minute, that if we can see this fundamental change, there's opportunity for fundamental change? Or do you think it's quite hopeless?
I'm not sure, but honestly, I think that the optimism is perverse. It's like, so the house burned down, but it needed to be painted, so it's okay.
Well, but I suppose if you didn't think the house could ever be burnt down, it's more. So like,
it proved how bad everything is. See, we were right. Doggone it, we told you this was not a fair society, and now anyway. So I guess my own view is that it's not an optimistic view, but I think that recognizing it can also let us see a few things. It can let us see why large portions of the working class might be attached to capitalism, and might really be afraid of capitalism's coming down, right? Because what they see their lives getting worse and worse and worse. And so people who are going to defend capitalism might have an advantage, right? I think that the neo-feudal hypothesis means that the left has to think about our arguments maybe a little. I mean, it might ultimately end up being, at the end of the day, the same kinds of arguments, but I think recognizing how attachment to capitalism can look different now can be important for us.
No, I think that's extremely important point. I mean, and yeah, making visible this question of attachment to capitalism and how it plays out. I mean, before we run out of time, I mean, I sort of wanted to, and I guess this relates to it. What does the left do? Let's say, and I was really interested in what you were writing about anti-communism. This is a piece that you'll be able to read in the Sublation Magazine just now, so you can click on that. But and one of the things you identify here is fascinating when you say that anti-communism increased over COVID. So I'd love to hear why you claim that. But the point that you're making really, fundamentally, if I've got it right, is that we need to be a left that isn't scared of the state
that's right.
As a way of dealing with these problems. And perhaps it occurs to me to ask in the question this way, can a left that believes in the state help us out against the feudal order that seems to be?
Oh, I love this. I love this question so much. So so part of because you really pinpointed kind of like the political valence of the argument I'm making, and I mean I'm making an argument for giant centralized states,
yes.
Right? Anything if I was going to do the crudest reduction of my argument, it'd be like anything that's not a giant centralized state is feudal, and so that's bad. Like feudalism is fragmentation, or put a little bit less, reductively, the left has got to stop thinking of decentralization as a goal.
Yes.
That I mean, in the United States is a federal society. Federalism means that as soon as the right to an abortion is overturned by the Supreme Court, which will probably happen in the next 2 or 3 weeks, every state will have different abortion laws. And over half the states are going to completely outlaw it. That's federalism. That's decentralization. Decentralization in the U.S. context was also freaking Southern states' rights, which supported slavery, Jim Crow, lynching, the worst kinds of segregation. So this idea that somehow centralized power is bad is wrong. It's just wrong. Yeah. It's just that we've got to get over that, and so that's the first thing, and then with the neo-feudal argument then lets us say, okay, like making all these different kinds of separate any argument for decentralization fragments things further and can't be a version of support, emancipation, and sort of a guarantee for a reasonable life for the majority of people, right? Because they can never be sure that there won't be more and more fragmentation. Like, well, this little city is going to say that their schools do X, and if you don't want your schools to do X, you have to move. Yeah. Right? Everything, like fragmentation is the enemy. So I think the left needs to be in favor of seizing the state and making it work. We need that kind of strong organizational form to combat climate change, and clearly the pandemics have let us see that we need it for that.
And this question of anti-communism is part of explaining why this hasn't happened. Because one thing that occurs to me, I mean, from I think around the COVID time, slightly before, was when Jeremy Corbyn's potential Labour manifesto included the idea of a state Wi-Fi. Everyone reacted. Yeah, I thought so too. But everyone sort of reacted. But these communists are going to be reading our brains, using the router, So like that, which is bizarre because we're quite happy to allow, Facebook and Amazon, Alexa or whatever it is into our home and hand over all of that sort of data, whatever it might be, to a private company. But when it's the suggestion that the state does it, people are shouting, this is dystopian communism or whatever. It's totally bizarre that people feel happy to trust a private company but not the state.
It is totally bizarre, and I've wondered for a long time, like, is this true, right? Like, is it really the case? Is it somehow that when people like hand over massive amounts of data to Facebook and Google that we just don't think about it? Is that it? Like I don't really somehow, but if it's the state, somehow it becomes more visible to us. I'm not really sure. Or we think that, like I once mentioned, something along these lines to students, and they're like, yeah, but I don't mind the advertising. It tells me what to buy. like, oh, okay, well, I guess.
But I suppose what I wanted to ask with that example is, isn't it that anti-communism, as part of what you're saying, anti-communism is used to stop people, trusting in the state, whereas communism itself, in your idea of it and in what it actually is, would be that we would have these big state, and we would, to a certain extent, trust in those. But what
for a while, right? The dictatorship of the proletariat. Like, we've got to recognize transitional forms. My comrade and colleague Kai Heron and I have a piece coming out on climate Leninism, and it'll be the second. We've been writing about this for a while, really emphasizing transition and thinking through, okay, what do we need actually for political transition? It's not going to happen by 25 people having a potluck twice a week. Like, that's not it. Right, particularly in a global, given climate change is global, pandemics are global, at this point supply chains are global, we need large-scale, enormous institutions. Now, as communists, does that mean that we think that these will be the final form? Hell no, right? God, that's right. Like, we've got to, but you need them to transition. We need them as a way to make it the case as fossil fuels are in the ground. What happens to people who've worked in those sectors, right? They need to be given all sorts of support, right, and opportunities to do other kinds of work. And that's and don't throw them to the mercy of crappy markets, right?
Yeah, I totally agree with it, and I think also the idea that we should use this term communism or stick with this term communism, I think it's important. I think we saw it with as Corbyn's example again, like the BBC showing him with like a Russian hat on, and so it's communism has become this kind of scare thing, as you wrote about yourself, but actually this is really just a kind of superficial idea of what communism is, and if we argued for it properly, it would take away that scariness. And
I think absolutely right, and it's important on the left, and I think that we've seen in the last 10 years, in part because of Corbyn, in part because of Sanders, in part because of rising left kind of media sphere, and also because things suck so bad, people are looking for something. Like, we've seen more efforts in this direction than, say, in the first decade of the 2000s, when too many on the left were on the, we do have to accept some version of markets. And I think now people are like, no. I mean, at least on the left. But we need to be able to give the positive name, communism, rather than say, there's all sorts of vocabulary to not name a positive alternative. And when we can call it communism, then, like you said, we make an argument for it. And we say, like, yes, it does mean you're not going to be able to go get designer bags after you work 5 years, but you won't want to, right? Right.
I mean, this was also, the very last thing, we should wrap up, but this was, I don't want to keep you, but I've found it fascinating when you're talking about the question of loss, which you just mentioned with these designer bags, like why as soon as you talk about communism, everyone starts saying, but I won't have my car, I won't have my bag, but actually...
They don't have it.
You don't have it now, and you won't want it then,
Yeah, it's so interesting, the way that communism has been, because of anti-communism, associated with a theft of enjoyment. And so instead of being able to grapple with why they don't have it, they projected onto this thing that will take them if they had it.
No, I think it's fascinating, and thanks so much for talking to us about it. People should read all of these things. There's one piece in the New Left Review, one in LA Review of Books, that both from this month, aren't they, or read for the last month or so.
Actually, the LA Review of Books one was like 2 years old.
Oh, okay. And the new one is there.
And the new one it's in Sidecar.
NLR Sidecar. And then this piece will be in Sublation Magazine as well. So it's been really interesting. We should all get our arguments for communism together. Thanks for doing it, Jodi.
Great, thanks.